The crisis is not only Karamoja, it is a countrywide crisis, by the way, but Karamoja is highlighting it. As an expert in the right to food, I think the interventions have not been handled the way they ought to have been handled, and this is why. In times when you have a crisis or a food emergency, you need to be very careful. One, although some people are starving, you don't need to panic. The moment you panic, you make too many mistakes. And someone can ask, how can a government panic? Of course, they do, because they will panic into buying, you see? And then when they do buy, they eventually buy even food that is not safe for consumption. It may not even be contaminated, but if someone has not been eating and you introduce food that is completely alien to them, you are violating their right to food, because food must be culturally appropriate. Secondly, when you do panic buying, you lose out the principles, because ideally food ought to have been bought from the region. You know, it could have been sorghum, because those people eat a lot of sorghum. It could have been millet. It could have been grain in terms of, real maize. And when you now put them on posho, this might again be alien to them, and it will fail the entire process. Number two is, when you have an emergency, you cannot just buy everything and say, okay, I'm distributing food without guidelines. Because what you are doing is not charity. You are dispensing a legal obligation. Nobody is in love with the government. No, this is not a moral obligation. Nobody is a relative to you as government. The relationship between an individual and government is a legal relationship, meaning that even if I support the government or not, I must get the service. So the way you approach a legal obligation is not the way you approach like a moral obligation. You can now not start distributing food, buying food, and giving food to people who are starving without a guideline, a clear guideline. And that guideline shouldn't be in anyone's office. It must be published in the Gazette. Because we know how human beings behave. You remember very well that during COVID-19, the two episodes we got, the first one, they distributed food that killed people. Of course, nobody has done an audit. We are in Uganda, but we have highlighted this. And I don't need to even overmake the point. The Uganda National Bureau of Standards gave us the statistics. They said at least the food they tested, 38% of the sample was contaminated. And by the time they came in to test, it was, people had already been, distributed with the food. Secondly, the Prime Minister, when they gave out money, we were all shocked later to learn that even some people who are not supposed to get the money got it. This is why we insist that before you do an emergency kind of intervention, it must be guided. It must be with the guidelines very clear. Because beyond the Prime Minister, for example, will not go to Karamoja to distribute to individual families. But you know what happens in our villages. You may have an LC person who doesn't like a family X. What if I don't get? How do I start now to even hold them accountable? That is number two. Number three, when you have a food crisis, you must look at what the law requires you to do. Because beyond the food that you are giving me, today if you gave me food, I'll eat and finish. Then the following day, I'll again put up my hands to beg. You must work on a system that is giving us short-term, immediate, immediate, which is like food, then short term, maybe medium term, and long term. So you cannot just come up and say, we have given them food. So what? What do I do next after here? So you must make sure that your intervention is not only a one-off. No, you must make sure that there is inbuilt a system that is going to get us out of where we are. Because for food security, there are 3 levels. We always are looking at the before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis. If those 3 levels are not taken care of, we did not take care of the before. Now we find ourselves in a crisis, mood. Now, we are going to again get another crisis. Because after eating this food, I don't have anywhere to get more food. And then what next? Then 4, beyond the food that you provide as an emergency, you cannot only look at food. Because right now, due to panic and everything, you bring flour. But who told you that flour is eaten as flour? We must mingle it. For me to mingle food, I must have firewood. I must have water. Did we look at that? If you are giving me food, are we sure that these people are having firewood or any other energy source to cook the food? Are we sure that we have the water for these people to eat food? Because food will be distributed to people who have seen it, and instead of helping the family, they'll now exchange it to get these other, commodities that they do not have. Or in other households, people sell it out. Now, in coming up with a plan, you also need to know that food is like in Uganda, we get it from plants. Have you looked at how quickly can I help these people to grow plants? I come from Central Region. In case of hunger, in my traditional society, they could, in fact, advise people to plant pumpkins. Because the moment you plant pumpkins, in a few weeks, you'll even have leaves to eat. So have you looked at some of these issues? And if we are talking about maybe seeds and what, where are they going to get the seeds from? So these are some of the issues that we think that the government has not looked at. And more profoundly, we are not doing ourselves a service, because what happened to our food reserves? We must ask these hard questions. It is a hard question, but I have no choice but to ask this question. I want to ask the office of the Prime Minister, how long and do you have the capacity to give us food in case we all run into this emergency? I think you don't. The only thing that exonerates you and the government is to tell us we have these food reserves in these regions, and our food reserves, we can now not maybe, pick more food. This is where we are. But in absence of any, we'll continue coming back to you agitating that we must have these food reserves. And on this point again, I want to speak to development partners. I think we need to engage in a very honest discussion on this issue. When you give us the aid, for example, if it is going to Karamoja, let us not be reactive. Let us not be reactive. Let us now go into building a system that will help people feed themselves in dignity. Because when you give me food, you are bordering, by the way, you are bordering, violating my right to freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment. Everyone must be able to feed themselves in dignity. So maybe let us work towards having a system. If you are giving us money from you, our dear development partners, we really appreciate all your efforts. We really appreciate. We know that you have given money to northern Uganda, to all of us, to Karamoja. But I think time has come where you need now to tag your money to maybe a food system. how many times are you going to be, running towards, responding to an emergency?